He thought humiliating a poor waitress would be the highlight of his evening until her final words shattered everything he believed about himself. In the glittering dining room of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, champagne flowed and power brokers laughed. But at table 7, a young woman in a stained uniform stood frozen, a spilled drink at her feet, while a man in a $10,000 suit unleashed words designed to destroy her. Every eye in the room turned to watch her humiliation. What no one knew, not the billionaire, not the silent witnesses, not even the trembling waitress herself, was that this moment would change everything. Because sometimes the people we look down on are the ones who can teach us what it truly means to be human. And sometimes the cruelest moment of your life becomes the one that saves you. Before we dive into this story that'll make you question everything you think you know about success and dignity, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this, stories that remind us what truly matters, need to be shared. Drop a like if you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter their station in life. Now, let's begin. Nathaniel Cross didn't just enter rooms, he conquered them. At 38, he'd built an empire in commercial real estate that stretched across 3 continents. His net worth had 9 zeros. His suits cost more than most people's cars. His watch could have fed a family for a year. And he knew it. God, did he know it. On this particular Friday evening in October, Nathaniel sat at his usual table in Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where reservations required 3 months' notice and connections that money alone couldn't buy. He was hosting 7 investors, men and women who controlled billions in capital, people whose approval he didn't need but enjoyed collecting anyway. The dining room glowed with golden light from crystal chandeliers. Mahogany panels lined the walls. Fresh orchids adorned every table. The soft murmur of wealth and power filled the air, deals being made, fortunes being discussed, the elite machinery of capitalism humming smoothly along. Nathaniel was in his element. He'd just closed a deal that would net him $75 million. The investors were impressed. The wine was a 1982 Chateau Margaux at $4,000 a bottle. Everything was perfect. Until she appeared. The new waitress was young, maybe 23, 24, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and an ill-fitting uniform that had clearly been worn by someone else before her. She moved nervously through the dining room, balancing a tray with practiced caution but obvious anxiety. Her name tag read, Sarah. Nathaniel noticed her the way predators notice wounded prey, with idle, cruel interest. "Excuse me, miss?" he called out as she passed near his table. Sarah turned, her face brightening with the hope of being helpful. "Yes, sir?" "This wine." Nathaniel held up his glass, swirling the deep burgundy liquid with affected sophistication. "It's supposed to be served at precisely 60 degrees. This is at least 63. Unacceptable." Sarah's smile faltered. I'm sorry, sir. I can bring you another bottle." "Another bottle?" Nathaniel's voice carried across the dining room. Other tables turned to watch. "Do you have any idea what this wine costs? And you think the solution is to simply open another bottle as if it's boxed wine from a convenience store?" The color drained from Sarah's face. "No, sir, I just meant, what's your background? Fast food? Diners?" Like Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, enjoying the attention from neighboring tables. His investors watched with uncomfortable amusement. "Let me guess, you're new here, trying to work your way up from whatever minimum wage situation you crawled out of, and now you're in a real restaurant, completely out of your depth. Sir, I apologize if—" "You apologize if?" Nathaniel's voice dripped with contempt. "There's no if. You're objectively incompetent. Look at yourself. Your uniform doesn't even fit. You look like you're playing dress up in someone else's clothes. This is Lumiere. We have standards. Perhaps you should find employment more suited to your capabilities." Sarah's hands trembled slightly. She clutched the empty tray against her chest like a shield. Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet. Other diners watched with that peculiar human mixture of pity and fascination, grateful it wasn't them, horrified but unable to look away. "I'm doing my best, sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely steady. "Your best?" Nathaniel laughed, a cold, cutting sound. "Darling, if this is your best, you've set a remarkably low bar for yourself. But I suppose that's the poverty mindset, isn't it? Accept mediocrity, settle for less, never aspire to actual excellence." One of Nathaniel's investors, a woman named Patricia, shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel, perhaps, no, no. Nathaniel held up a hand, warming to his performance. This is a teaching moment. You see, success isn't about participation trophies or everyone getting a chance. It's about excellence, about separating wheat from chaff, about knowing your place and having the self-awareness to stay there. He turned back to Sarah, who now had tears glistening in her eyes despite her obvious effort to maintain composure. You want to know the difference between you and me? Nathaniel continued. I saw opportunities and seized them. I worked harder, thought smarter, and earned everything I have. While you're here serving people who actually matter, probably complaining about tips and blaming society for your failures. That's the difference between winners and, well, whatever you are. The matron appeared, his face a mask of professional concern. Mr. Cross, perhaps I'm not finished. Nathaniel's voice had steel beneath the silk. I want this woman removed from my section. In fact, I want her removed from this restaurant entirely. Her presence diminishes the experience for paying customers. Customers like me who keep this establishment in business. Sarah's tears finally spilled over. She didn't sob, didn't make a scene. The tears just fell silently down her cheeks as she stood there, absorbing his cruelty with a dignity that would have moved anyone with a functioning conscience. But Nathaniel's conscience had been anesthetized by years of wealth and unchallenged power. Well, he prompted, are you going to stand there crying, or are you going to leave? Show some self-respect, for God's sake. That's when Sarah did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing in tears or defending herself, she simply looked at Nathaniel, really looked at him. Her gaze held something he couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not even hurt, really. Something deeper. Something that made him briefly, inexplicably uncomfortable. You're right, Mr. Cross, she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears. I don't belong in your world, and I never want to. She set down her tray with deliberate care, untied her apron, and folded it neatly on a nearby serving station. Then she walked out of Lumiere with her head held high, leaving behind a dining room full of uncomfortable silence and a billionaire who had just won a battle he didn't yet realize would cost him everything. Nathaniel turned back to his table, expecting approval, or at least resumed conversation. Instead, he found his investors studying their plates, their wine, the ceiling, anything but him. Where were we? He said brightly, refusing to acknowledge the awkwardness. Ah, yes, the Brooklyn Development Project. But the evening had soured. The conversations felt forced. Two of his investors made excuses and left early. Even Patricia, who'd known him for 15 years, seemed distant. When Nathaniel finally left Lumiere 3 hours later, he'd drunk too much wine and felt the peculiar emptiness that comes from victory without satisfaction. He'd humiliated a poor waitress who dared to serve him imperfectly. He'd asserted his dominance. He'd demonstrated his status. So why did he feel so hollow? He pushed the thought away, climbed into his waiting town car, and headed home to his penthouse. Alone, as always, in his golden cage. Nathaniel woke the next morning with a headache and a phone full of messages. Most were routine. Business correspondence, social invitations, requests for his time and money. But one stood out. It was from Patricia, the investor who'd witnessed his performance last night. Nathaniel, what you did last night was beneath you. That girl's dignity in the face of your cruelty showed more class than anything in that restaurant. I'm reconsidering our partnership. Nathaniel stared at the message, anger flaring. How dare she? He'd done nothing wrong. He'd simply maintained standards, expected excellence, refused to coddle mediocrity. He fired back a reply. Patricia, you're being emotional. This is business. I'll call you Monday to discuss. Her response came immediately. Don't bother. Over the next 3 days, 2 more investors quietly withdrew from his projects. No dramatic explanations, just polite, professional emails about different priorities and strategic realignments. But Nathaniel knew. Word had spread about the incident at Lumiere. His public relations team started fielding calls from gossip sites. Someone had recorded part of the confrontation on their phone. The video was circulating on social media. Nathaniel watched it once, saw himself on screen, resplendent in his expensive suit, casually destroying another human being while witnesses looked on in horror. The comments were illuminating. This is why people hate billionaires. That poor girl, she handled it with more grace than he'll ever have. Money can't buy decency. I hope karma destroys him. Nathaniel told himself it didn't matter. Social media was full of jealous failures who resented success. He was Nathaniel Cross. He was untouchable. But business was business, and business was being affected. His assistant informed him that 3 charities had returned his donations with terse notes about values alignment. A magazine that had planned to feature him on their cover suddenly postponed the interview indefinitely. And then Patricia called. "I'm not calling about business," she said without preamble. "I'm calling because I've known you for 15 years, and what I saw Friday night terrified me." "Terrified?" Nathaniel laughed. "Don't be dramatic. You genuinely enjoyed hurting that girl. You looked satisfied, happy even, like her pain entertained you. She was incompetent. She was nervous. She was new. She was trying. And you saw an opportunity to feel powerful by making her feel small." Patricia's voice was sad, not angry. "When did you become this person, Nathaniel?" "I became successful. I became someone who matters." "No," Patricia said quietly. "You became someone who needs others to be beneath you, so you can feel above them. There's a difference." She hung up before he could respond. Nathaniel spent the next several days trying to put the incident behind him. Work, deals, acquisitions, the usual machinery of his life. But something had shifted. The hollow feeling from that night at Lumiere hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. He found himself thinking about Sarah, about the way she'd looked at him with that strange, penetrating gaze before walking out, about her final words, "I don't belong in your world and I never want to." Why did that bother him? Why couldn't he shake it? On impulse, or perhaps something deeper than impulse, Nathaniel had his assistant track down information about Sarah. It wasn't difficult. Sarah Chen, 24 years old, living in Queens, worked 2 jobs to support herself and pay for night classes at community college. And there was more. More that his assistant delivered with uncomfortable hesitation. Sarah Chen had recently been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She was in the early stages of treatment, but had been told she needed a bone marrow transplant to have any real chance of survival. She'd taken the job at Lumiere specifically because their employee health insurance had better cancer coverage than her previous job washing dishes at a diner, the job she'd lost because of him. Nathaniel sat in his office, staring at the report, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, something that might have been shame if he'd still been capable of recognizing it. The girl he'd humiliated wasn't lazy or incompetent. She was dying. And she'd been fighting for her life with quiet courage while he'd been fighting for, what? His ego? His sense of superiority? He told himself it didn't change anything. Her illness didn't excuse poor service. Life was hard for everyone. Success was about overcoming obstacles, not using them as excuses. But the hollow feeling kept growing. Nathaniel couldn't let it go. Against every instinct that told him to move on, forget, focus on business, he found himself digging deeper into Sarah Chen's life. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Sarah wasn't just any waitress. She was his waitress. 24 years ago, Nathaniel Cross hadn't been born to wealth. He'd been born Nathan Kowalski, son of a single mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. His mother, Maria, had been a waitress, a cleaner, a seamstress, whatever would pay the bills. When Nathaniel was 14, Maria had gotten pregnant again. A mistake, she'd called it, from a brief relationship that hadn't lasted. She'd given birth to a baby girl at a free clinic in Queens. But Maria was already sick. Breast cancer she'd ignored for years because she couldn't afford treatment. She'd made a heartbreaking choice. She'd given the baby up for adoption, hoping the child would have a better life than she could provide. Then she'd worked herself literally to death to give Nathaniel, Nathan then, a chance at college, at success, at escaping poverty. She died when he was 18. He'd legally changed his name to Nathaniel Cross shortly after, erasing Nathan Kowalski and everything that name represented: poverty, struggle, shame. Now, sitting in his office with a private investigator's report spread across his desk, Nathaniel stared at the adoption records, at the birth certificate, at the DNA test he'd insisted on running after finding out Sarah Chen's birth mother had been a Maria Kowalski. Sarah Chen was his half-sister. The girl he'd humiliated, called incompetent, told to know her place. She was his sister. The sister he'd never known existed. The baby his mother had given up so she could give him everything. And now she was dying of the same disease that had killed their mother. while he lived in a penthouse worth $20 million. Nathaniel felt something break inside him, a wall he'd built so carefully, so completely that he'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in decades, Nathaniel Cross wept. Finding Sarah wasn't difficult. Confronting what he'd done to her was harder than anything he'd ever faced in business. She lived in a cramped studio apartment in Queens, the kind of place Nathaniel hadn't seen since his childhood, peeling paint, radiator heat, a window that looked out at another building. When she opened the door and saw him, her expression didn't change. No anger, no fear, just that same penetrating look she'd given him at the restaurant. "Mr. Cross," she said evenly. "Sarah, I—" He stopped. The speech he'd rehearsed died in his throat. "Can I come in?" She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Her apartment was tiny but meticulously clean. A small table held textbooks, biology, chemistry, anatomy, medical school prerequisites. A dream she was chasing while fighting for her life. They sat across from each other at that small table, and Nathaniel felt more out of place than he'd ever felt in any boardroom. "I know why you're here," Sarah said quietly. "You found out about the cancer. You feel guilty. You want to make a donation, salve your conscience, and move on with your life feeling like a good person." "No. I mean, yes." Nathaniel took a deep breath. "I know who you are, Sarah. I know who we are." Sarah's expression flickered, the first genuine emotion he'd seen. "What?" He showed her the documents, the adoption records, the DNA test. Everything. Sarah read in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she turned pages. When she finally looked up, tears streamed down her face. "She gave me away so you could have a better life," Sarah whispered. "Our mother. She sacrificed me for you. And I became the kind of person who would humiliate his own sister because she served wine at the wrong temperature," Nathaniel said, his voice breaking. "I became everything she wouldn't have wanted me to be." They sat in silence, two siblings who'd lived entire lives unaware of each other, now connected by DNA and the cruel irony of their meeting. "I want to help you," Nathaniel finally said. "The bone marrow transplant, treatment, medical bills. I can pay for everything. I can." "No." The word was soft but absolute. "Sarah, please. I have more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes. Let me do this. Let me do something right for once." Sarah shook her head, wiping her tears. "You don't understand, do you? I don't want your money, Nathaniel. I never did." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to understand what Mom understood. What I learned from my adoptive parents before they died in that car accident 3 years ago. What you forgot somewhere along your way to the top." She leaned forward, her gaze intense despite her obvious illness and exhaustion. "Money doesn't make you successful. Kindness does. Compassion does. How you treat people who can do nothing for you, that's what makes you rich. Mom died broke, but she was wealthy in all the ways that matter. She loved people. She helped people. She saw worth in everyone, not just the powerful and useful." Nathaniel felt tears on his own cheeks now. "I've become a monster." "No," Sarah said gently. "You've become lost. There's a difference. Monsters can't change. Lost people can find their way home. If this story is hitting different than you expected, you're not alone. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we need most." Hit that like button if you believe people can change, and drop a comment sharing a time when someone's words changed your perspective on life. Now let's see how this story ends. Over the following weeks, Nathaniel did something he'd never done. He showed up. Not with money, though he tried repeatedly to help and Sarah repeatedly refused. He showed up with time. He drove Sarah to chemotherapy appointments. He sat with her during the long, nauseating hours of treatment. He learned about her life, her adoptive parents who'd loved her until the accident, her dream of becoming a pediatric oncologist so she could help children with cancer, her quiet determination to make her brief life matter. And slowly, painfully, he began to see himself through her eyes. Not the billionaire Nathaniel Cross, master of the universe, but Nathan Kowalski, the boy whose mother had worked herself to death, believing her son would be better than their circumstances. "She was so proud of you," Sarah told him one afternoon as they sat in the hospital waiting for test results. "I found letters she wrote but never sent to the adoption agency, updating them on your life in case I ever wanted to find you. She talked about your scholarships, your business success. She thought she'd done the right thing, sacrificed me so you could have everything." And I used everything to become someone who treats people like you the way I did. You treated me like you treat yourself, Sarah said softly, with contempt, like nothing but your accomplishments mattered, like human worth could be measured in dollars and status. She was right. Nathaniel had spent 20 years punishing himself for coming from poverty by proving he was better than everyone else, and in the process, he'd become worse than anyone. The test results came back. The cancer was progressing faster than expected. Lund, Sarah needed the bone marrow transplant immediately, but no matches had been found in the registry. Nathaniel got tested. He wasn't a match. He offered money for private donor searches, experimental treatments, anything. Sarah refused it all. Why? He demanded one night, frustrated and desperate. Why won't you let me help? I'm your brother. I have resources. I can. Because you still think money is the answer, Sarah interrupted gently. You still think you can write a check and fix everything, solve problems by throwing wealth at them. But some things can't be bought, Nathaniel. Some things can only be earned. Like what? Like forgiveness, like peace, like knowing you lived as the person you were meant to be, not the person you pretended to be. Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly after that. Within 2 months, she was in hospice care. Nathaniel spent every day at her bedside, ignoring his business, his deals, his empire. Patricia visited once and found him there, holding his dying sister's hand. You found your way home, Patricia said simply. On Sarah's last day of consciousness, Nathaniel sat beside her, holding her hand, the sister he'd known for such a brief time but who'd changed everything. I'm sorry, he whispered for the 1,000th time. I'm so sorry for how I treated you, for who I became, for wasting so many years being someone Mom wouldn't have recognized. Sarah squeezed his hand weakly, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel, you were never the monster you thought you were. You were just lost. But you found your way back. You remembered what matters. That's what Mom would have wanted. Not your money, not your success, just your heart. She paused, breathing laboriously, gathering strength for her final words. Promise me something. Anything. Promise you'll remember. Remember that every person you meet, the waitress, the janitor, the person serving you coffee, they're someone's whole world. They're fighting battles you can't see. They deserve dignity. They deserve kindness. They deserve to be human, not invisible. Tears streamed down Nathaniel's face. I promise, and promise, you'll use everything you have, all that money, all that power, to help people who can't help you back, to give others the chances Mom tried to give us, to be the man she believed you could be. I promise. God, Sarah, I promise. Sarah smiled, the most beautiful smile Nathaniel had ever seen. Then you're already richer than you ever were before, she whispered, because you finally understand what wealth really means. Those were her last words. Sarah Chen died that evening with her brother holding her hand, having taught him in 3 months what 20 years of success had failed to, that the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they give. Not their bank account, but their humanity. 6 months later, Nathaniel Cross stood in the dining room of Lumiere. But this time, he wasn't there as a customer. He'd bought the restaurant, not to own it, but to transform it. Lumiere was now a training restaurant where formerly homeless individuals and people from disadvantaged backgrounds learned culinary and hospitality skills. Every person who completed the program left with job placement assistance, interview clothing, and a scholarship fund for further education if they wanted it. The program was called Maria's Table, after his mother. Nathaniel still ran his real estate company, but it looked very different now. 30% of his properties were now affordable housing. He'd started a foundation that paid for cancer treatment for uninsured patients. He'd established scholarship programs for first-generation college students. And every Friday evening, Nathaniel could be found at Maria's Table, not at the best table being served, but in the kitchen, helping train students, washing dishes alongside them, listening to their stories. On this particular Friday, a young trainee named Marcus nervously served wine to a table of investors Nathaniel had invited. The boy was clearly anxious, his hands shaking slightly. One of the investors, a newcomer who didn't know Nathaniel's story, started to complain about the service. Nathaniel quietly stood, walked over to the table, and gently took the wine bottle from Marcus's trembling hands. Marcus is doing an excellent job. Nathaniel said firmly but kindly. He's learning, he's trying, and he's showing more courage than most people ever will. If you can't treat him with respect, you're welcome to leave. The investor, shocked, looked around the table at the other guests, all of whom nodded in agreement. He stammered an apology. Nathaniel turned to Marcus, whose eyes were wide with gratitude and relief. "You're doing great," Nathaniel said softly. "Keep going. You belong here." As Marcus returned to the kitchen, strengthened by kindness instead of destroyed by cruelty, Nathaniel felt something he'd never felt in all his years of business success: genuine peace. He thought of Sarah, of her last words, of the promise he'd made. On the wall of the restaurant, visible to everyone who entered, hung a plaque with a quote: "The true measure of wealth is not what we accumulate, but what we give. Not how we elevate ourselves, but how we lift others." In memory of Sarah Chen and Maria Kowalski, two women who understood that the richest life is one spent in service to others. Nathaniel stood looking at that plaque, remembering the night he'd humiliated a poor waitress and thinking she was beneath him, remembering how her last words had shattered his world and rebuilt it into something infinitely better. He'd been a billionaire before, but now, finally, he was rich. Some lessons cost us everything to learn. Nathaniel Cross lost his sister, lost years of genuine living, nearly lost his humanity, all because he'd confused wealth with worth, power with purpose. It took the grace of a dying woman to show him what his mother had known all along, that every person carries infinite value regardless of their bank account. That service to others is the highest calling. That the real poverty isn't lacking money, it's lacking compassion. Sarah Chen lived only 24 years, but she left a legacy that would touch thousands, not through wealth or fame, but through the simple power of dignity, forgiveness, and radical kindness. And Nathaniel Cross, who'd once thought he had everything, discovered that he'd had nothing until he learned to see people, really see them, as his mother and sister always had, as human beings deserving of respect, kindness, and the chance to be their best selves. In the end, Sarah's last words didn't just leave Nathaniel in tears. They left him transformed. And that transformation rippled outward, touching lives, changing systems, proving that one person's compassion can indeed change the world. Because the greatest wealth isn't measured in what we own, but in how we love. Not in what we achieve, but in who we become. Not in the monuments we build to ourselves, but in the lives we touch with gentleness and grace. Sarah understood that. And now, finally, so did Nathaniel. If Sarah's words hit you the way they hit Nathaniel, you're not alone. This story reminds us that everyone we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and that our words and actions have power we often don't realize. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories that challenge us to be better, kinder, and more human. Hit that like button if you think everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their job, status, or circumstances. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that compassion is never weakness. It's the strongest thing we can offer this world. And drop a comment telling us, have you ever had someone's words completely change your perspective on life? What did they say, and how did it transform you? Remember Sarah Chen. Remember that the person serving your coffee, cleaning your office, or helping you in the store is someone's whole world. Treat them that way. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll explore more truths about love, loss, redemption, and what it really means to be wealthy. Until then, choose kindness. Always choose kindness. This was a Billionaire Empire story, where love proves richer than gold.